Hey everyone, and welcome to my preseason tier list video. So let's start out by talking about the meta. As I said in the preseason thoughts video, I don't think there are a ton of changes. There's a couple new items like Rod of Ages and Ravenous Hydra, and both of those are fairly significant. We'll talk about those champions. But the big thing is just the meta is quite fast-paced at the moment, and that means that champions that like to skirmish or have a lot of early game power are going to be much higher on the list than you saw before. I also added a B+ category here just to kind of, A tier was getting really big, so I just wanted to kind of spread it out a little. But yeah, you're likely to see a lot more kind of skirmishing champions higher on the list. Some of the just like the pure 1v1 champs that like maybe don't want to skirmish early, they just like want to 1v1 and scale, maybe a bit lower on the list, but overall it shouldn't be too different from before. So looking over at our S tier here, we have Syndra and Zed, and the way Syndra was redesigned in her rework is she was meant to be quite a lot easier. She was also meant to be quite a lot weaker early, but scale really well. And the thing is, she scales really well. She is easier, but she also has a much stronger early game, I think, than Riot intended, and a big reason for that is her really low mana cost. So I think Syndra is kind of just like the best of everything at the moment. She's like really good in pretty much every stage of the game. She's got pretty good gank setup. I guess the biggest weakness is her immobility, but if you play well, if you position correctly, you can deal with this. Zed is always kind of a strong solo queue pick, and especially now, like his Ravenous Hydra build is looking good. To be honest, a lot of champions that are going to use Ravenous Hydra are going to be good. And I'll maybe talk about that a bit later in the video, but Zed is pretty much always the premier AD assassin. The only one that ever really contests Zed for being the best assassins are like Qiyana and Talon, but Yone and Talon, they're just not quite as good as Zed at the moment, so I would recommend playing Zed if you're looking to play an AD assassin at the moment. Now, Sylas is one that you're maybe expecting to be an S tier because he has been for quite some time. But the thing is, a lot of these champions that are up here are actually very good against Sylas, so it's starting to kind of take away from his blind pick ability. As you might remember, Sylas is kind of, he's another very good solo queue pick because he's very good at skirmishing, and he became overpowered because with his Q-Max build, he was able to neutralize a lot of the meta matchups. But just a lot of these champions up here, they either scale extremely well into Sylas, we got champions like Kassadin or Syndra, or they just kind of destroy him in lane. So there's a lot of champions that play here, you know, Pantheon, Zoe, Cassia, Rumble. A lot of these do very well into Sylas in the lane, so he's not quite as good at blind pick before. I still think he's like a very strong counter, and he is just like strong in solo queue, but I don't think he's S tier anymore. Speaking of blind picks, Ahri has fallen down quite a lot. I think Ahri's main strength in solo queue is her blind pick ability and the fact that she works well in every comp and can neutralize most lanes. That being said, I think again, the champions up here are quite good versus Ahri. I think Syndra, Zed, Sylas, and Kassadin are all very good against Ahri, so I don't think she's really the best blind pick anymore. I would say if you're blind picking now, I think Syndra is a really good blind, Ryze is a really good blind. Even some of the assassins up here actually can be good blinds as well, so I don't think Ahri really has that much of a niche anymore. It kind of feels like if you're counterpicking with Ahri, you'd probably rather counterpick LeBlanc instead. Like, she's still fine, don't get me wrong, but I don't really think she has something over the other champs anymore. You might also be surprised by Rumble being so high on the list. I actually quite like Rumble mid. I think he has a really strong lane, especially against like other melee champs, but I still didn't think he was like amazing in solo queue. But during the time between the last tier list and this one, I found this guy in Korea who was ranked 33. Unfortunately, hasn't played in the preseason, but before that was spamming Rumble mid, so pretty good effect. And I've tried it out, and I think it is feeling really good. So I think Rumble especially, he really benefits from the meta at the moment. Like a lot of kind of weaker laning champions that like to skirmish, like Rumble was very good against like sort of short range champs. It does kind of struggle against like a lot of the longer range, you know, if it goes back to a lot of Azir, Victor, that sort of stuff. Rumble is definitely not the best at that, but as long as like these other champs remain relatively strong, I think Rumble as well has a place up in the A+ tier for sure. Put Ryze and Kassadin very high as well. So Kassadin used to be in the S tier counters. I think Rod of Ages obviously is very good on Kassadin, but Catalyst as a component is extremely good for neutralizing bad lanes, so that makes it quite a bit easier to blind pick Kassadin than it was before. To be honest, Kassadin was never really like an awful blind pick, but it was certainly better as a counter pick, right? But I think now you could blind pick Kassadin and be fine. Obviously, counter picking Kassadin is really, really good, as it always is, but I think he deserves to come out of S tier counter and into, you know, pretty high tier for solo queue. Ryze is an interesting one because I've always thought that Ryze is pretty strong in solo queue, and it's definitely a champ I've played a lot in the past, but Ryze's biggest weakness previously was his team fighting. He was relatively short range, and he also didn't really have the tankiness to back it up, so it was just very difficult to team fight unless you were very ahead either yourself or you'd snowballed the game a lot, so that kind of put a lot of pressure on you to snowball the game. It was almost like playing Twisted Fate. So I think Ryze now is like significantly easier, and that weakness is partially patched up. Like, I still don't think his team fighting is great, but with Rod of Ages, he's a lot tankier than before. He's also got the inbuilt healing, so it's really, really nice. I think he's very strong on the list, and probably my premier blind pick. Maybe, yeah, between Ryze and Syndra for premier blind, but Ryze is a really solid choice at the moment. Pantheon is another champ that I'm a pretty big fan of. Pantheon is just really good in skirmish-heavy metas. He doesn't have the best 1v1 matchups against a lot of the mages because they can outrange him, but he does have good gank setup and he's very, very good in the 2v2 and 3v3. So he kind of excels in this meta at the moment. I also think his Eclipse Bork build is quite strong. The biggest weakness of Pantheon is it's very likely that you will end up with a full AD team, especially if you're playing in low elo, because people don't like to play AP junglers. But I think as you get towards like Platinum, Diamond, and up, people are much more likely to pick AP junglers, and so that makes having an AD mid in your pool quite useful, and Pantheon's a really good option for that. He's like relatively easy to play and also just like, again, very strong in that early game and affords quite a lot of options. Again, you've got like your gank setup, you've got like a global ultimate, like good skirmishing, so you've got a lot of avenues to win the game. Put Yone and Yasuo lower on the list than they were before because I think these champions are very, very good in the isolated 1v1, but again, this is a very heavy 2v2, 3v3 meta, and these champs aren't that great in there, at least not in the early game. Yasuo is kind of an exception because Yasuo with Diana is insanely broken. Like I think Yasuo Diana as a combo is an S tier. They would definitely be an S tier, but I think just on its own, it's not amazing. You're really kind of like relying on your team to bring a lot of stuff. Yone is like, he's kind of held back by his matchups. Like I think a lot of these champions up here can do very well into Yone in the early game, but if you can get through the early game and you're maybe like even in CS or you're up CS, like you're definitely looking at kind of like the A+ tier for Yone, but it's just like that early game, it can be very, very punishing. Either you're kind of like taking too much damage and so you're kind of just like forced to sit in the tower while your opponent skirmishes and you can't really get involved, or you're like trying to get involved in skirmishes, but your opponents are just a bit stronger. You know, if you're talking like a level 6 Yone against like a level 6 Akali in terms of the impact they bring to a fight, you just don't bring as much as she does. So they're still pretty good, and honestly in their niche situations they're both still like really good, like A+ or S tier, but they're kind of situations where they're good in, there's definitely less of them than before. As I've said before, the meta is a lot about 2v2 and 3v3 at the moment, so I've moved champions that are very good in the 1v1 but not good at skirmishing a bit lower. So champions like Victor and Ori that are kind of like, you know, typically built for the 1v1 but don't really want to fight in skirmishes too much in the early game, definitely move them a bit lower down. They're still really good, but you need to make sure that you're chunking out your opponent enough that they're not even able to go for fights. You kind of like really need to make sure that isolated 1v1 just like stays like that. And sometimes that is sort of out of your control. You know, in solo queue, random stuff happens a lot of the time. So if you can make sure not to get involved in that, you can definitely still outscale, right? Like they're not weak by any means. They're still in the A tier, but it is a bit more difficult, I think, to play them, and you got to be like really disciplined and make sure you play to what like your champion wants and not get sucked into all the random fights. Finally, I think there are some champions that could be on this list that I haven't really put on there. I think Ravenous Hydra is really OP at the moment, so there's like a lot of champions that can maybe abuse that. Like I saw Vega V2 tweet about Ravenous Kled earlier today. There's other champions like maybe Ravenous Nocturne that could be good, but I haven't tried these champions and I haven't seen these champions played yet, so I didn't want to put them on here because I think it's like a bit misleading if I haven't really had any experience with them. But I guess bear in mind that there's like potentially a lot of AD top laners or AD junglers that could actually be played mid with some of the new items. There's also some of the tank champs that may just be like strong enough now with Heartsteel that they can just be considered a blind pick. Like I think champions like Sion, for example, Sion is like a good counter pick, but he's also like a pretty decent blind pick. And again, most people aren't going to know that it's Sion mid if you're just like blinding Sion, right? Like people just don't know. So I think like that could be pretty solid. But again, I don't really want to move it before I see it more and like try it out a bit more myself. So I guess just like be aware that like preseason is like 6 weeks long in total and a lot of stuff will change over that time. So this is my preseason list for now based off what I've seen, but a lot of stuff can definitely change. So I think that's going to be my finished tier list for now. If you have any thoughts about any champs that I haven't covered on here, please put them in the comment section below. I'll be interested to read them because obviously like I don't play every champ in the game and I also don't see every champ in the game in my games. So it's always interesting to hear other people's opinions. As always, guys, if you did like the video, go ahead and like and subscribe. And otherwise, I'll see you guys next time.